What is going on, guys? Welcome back. An impromptu show on the night of the fight. It's what we're about. Jimmy is on a laptop farther across the country than he normally is, so if he sounds a little weird, I know what to tell you. And if you're here now, you've got a little bit of time before this show starts. We're going to cover the main event, the co-main, and then we'll throw in MVP as a bonus. Taking a look at Bellator tonight in Japan Toyota, tomorrow if you're there. We're going to start this card with Michael Venom Page and a former UFC fighter in Anzai. This guy is a constant pressure in terms of his fighting, well-rounded in terms of fighting, but really just that step-down guy. I think that's going to be the narrative here. I like Anzai with his kicks to the body. I think he's solid inside knees, but, he's going against a guy that traditionally it's hard to get inside to have that game work. And when you look at Michael Venom Page, I think we all know the story. The unconventional stance, strikes from anywhere, kind of a lesser Israel Adesanya, if you will, kind of like a very much lesser Israel Adesanya. I think this is MVP's fight. His highlights, in a way, I think diminish that he is a very good boxer and could strike conventionally if he wanted to. But I think the bigger story is not only the catchweight we talked about here, but they've kind of fed him now 3 fights in a row after the Lima loss. And that just kind of rubs me the wrong way. I don't like, and we're going to talk about this in the next fight too, unfortunately, I don't like how Scott Coker kind of puts together these specials where I want some competitive balance in my fights. And a lot of times we just don't get them in Bellator.
Look, the major problem with Bellator, and I mean this sincerely as in, when I was there, I felt the same way about it. Parity's hard. The kind of parity you want from Bellator requires a depth Bellator doesn't have. Meaning, we have MVP, needle mover. All right? People like watching MVP. They like the highlights. He does well in London. He's a great UK fighter, whatever. We don't have the depth to have him lose 2 or 3 times in a row, lose a lot of his shine, and we'll make another one of those. Right? That's what you're saying, essentially. When you are taking a fighter like MVP and you've brought him up the way they have, what you're saying partially is if he goes down and we lose that shine, we can't easily get it back. We don't have the depth to reach into our pool at 170 pounds, which is one of their deeper divisions, actually, and make another one of these guys. We can't really do that. So we have to be careful with the ones we have. Michael Venom Page is one of those guys. Now, I'm not saying he's a bad fighter. I'm not saying that he can't knock guys out, that that he doesn't have ability. And getting through the tournament the way he did, knocked out by Douglas Lima, but did have a win against Paul Daly, the biggest name of his career. Big, rivalry fight. It was a 5-rounder. I don't think he's getting enough credit for that. But you're right. Since the Douglas Lima loss, it's been 2 guys no one's ever heard of. And he's taking a fight here in Japan against someone who washed out in the UFC, is not a great fighter by any stretch of the imagination. MVP gets a lot of showcases. And part of that is he's flashy, makes great highlights. People like watching him fight. But if we put him against the best, we don't believe he can necessarily come out on top. And we don't have the depth to just create another fighter like him. That's the tacit admission of giving him the kind of fights you have.
The problem with that is, and we're going to talk about this as we transition into Michael Chandler versus Sydney Outlaw at a 160-pound catch. Again, Bellator, get this together. You talk about a guy in Outlaw. He's fought everywhere, right? He's a great wrestler. Proven by the fact if you're a casual and you don't know his name, this guy had a draw with Gregor Gillespie. But again, it's a poor matchup. He's going against Chandler, who is just relentless. One of the best single-leg takedowns you're ever going to see. Heavy with pressure. And as you mentioned, Outlaw was a turn-down winner from the Contender Series. He's not going to be put into a place to beat the face of Bellator. It's just not going to happen. You're fast-tracking Chandler back to a belt, or you're setting up to walk away, losing to essentially what is a journeyman. But the problem is, when we look at either one of these fights, you're putting 2 of your biggest stars against 2 castaways from your biggest rival. And when you do that, all you do is further generate that disparity between the UFC and Bellator. And as fans, that's what we try to get away from. You're trying to drive this narrative that you have high quality, world-class athletes, but then you end up putting them up against turndowns from your biggest rival. And if there wasn't this competition of which one is better, which clearly UFC is, you only stoke that fire by putting your best faces up against lesser quality opponents that have been turned down from the UFC. It just looks bad. And I guess, you know, like you said, there's only so many world caliber athletes and fighters, but at the same time, give me entertainment, you know, for a portion of this. Don't give me these unbalanced matchups.
I think in the case of Michael Chandler, to be honest, Michael Chandler was the Wheaties box guy for Bellator for a long time, really since the Eddie Alvarez fight, the first one. He was the guy, when you said, is there anybody in Bellator that could compete at the UFC level, the elite UFC level, most people would have said Michael Chandler. The problem is he has had some serious setbacks in Bellator, motivated a lot by a shockingly inadequate fight IQ. And what I mean by this is it's hard to find a fighter at 170 pounds who has a better skill set than Michael Chandler, who's a better athlete than Michael Chandler, who has the confidence of Michael Chandler. It's not easy to find all those things. The way he fights sometimes, even in victory, blows my mind. He has a lot of trouble with his pacing. He has a lot of trouble getting in firefights when he shouldn't do that, when he can rely on his other skills. He has a problem going to war every single time when it doesn't behoove him. And starting with, I would say, the second fight with Eddie Alvarez, very close split decision, when I thought he fought in a reckless manner, and the veteran Eddie Alvarez was able to kind of weather the storm and win rounds and ultimately win that fight. I thought against Will Brooks, who's also another physically talented fighter, that Michael Chandler couldn't just, you know, bowl over with his explosiveness, who was at the time a very smart fighter. Chandler couldn't find a way around him. And since then, it's kind of been 2 steps forward, 1 step back. That's the story of Michael Chandler's career in Bellator since the second Eddie Alvarez fight, where it looked great against Benson Henderson, although, once again, terrible pacing in the fight. Exploded the first 3 rounds, and rounds 4 and 5, he's hanging on, trying to survive. Look at the suplex against Benson Henderson. You remember that? Yeah, the highlight
Yes.
of the fight, basically. A suplex. That highlight kind of captures to me Michael Chandler in one move. That is a high energy, low impact move. It costs a lot of gas to lift a guy up and arch him over your back and throw him, and it doesn't do a lot of damage. It's a stupid move. It looked great. We had a highlight for I don't know how long with that. They're still using it. But at the end of the day, it costs you a ton of energy when a punch does a lot more damage for a lot less energy. That's Michael Chandler. He blew Henderson away in the first round, you know, didn't do a whole lot worse in the second, started tapering off in the third, and was struggling in rounds 4 and 5. All right, he beats Benson Henderson. It goes against Brent Primus, a name not a lot of people knew, not a lot expected of Brent Primus, and goofy leg injury, and he's out. Beats Goichi Amuchi, beats Brandon Gertz, beats Brent Primus in a rematch, takes on Patricio Pitbull, and all he had to do was not stand in front of Patricio Pitbull, especially in the first couple rounds. And what does he do? He gets in a firefight and gets knocked out. It's like there was one way, essentially, you were going to lose to Patricio Pitbull. Dude's heavy-handed. He can knock you out. He didn't respect it and got knocked out. So I think they're doing the same thing with Michael Chandler. As you said, they're kind of setting him up, trying to get him back on track, just like MVP. But there's a lack of faith, I think, in Michael Chandler's ability to fight smart and win tough fights against tough talent. Because we saw how it bit him with Benson Henderson, where, you know, that was the original opponent he was supposed to face here in Japan. The first Benson Henderson fight, he got the best free agent signing in Bellator history, arguably. Gave him right to Michael Chandler. They believed he could win that fight, and he did. The choices he has made since then in certain fights makes them think, God, if we give him the best, maybe he once again makes a bad choice, brawls at the wrong time, and it costs him. And it's frustrating in that sense to watch Michael Chandler fight because he keeps making the same mistakes.
Two things. Number one, I challenge you that if there was a cereal that Bellator is involved in, it would be called Coker Crunch, and Captain Crunch would be replaced with like a cartoon Scott Coker. Number two, since you mentioned highlights, it absolutely must floor the Bellator promotional department that they cannot use Pride highlights when putting a fight together for Fedor and Rampage, because these are two guys in different classes, of course, that literally made Pride. And when you looked at their little previews, you could just tell they just wanted to put in those Pride highlights. So Fedor, obviously a natural heavyweight. I think this is really the first time Rampage is going to have kind of that true heavyweight. Obviously known for his left hook, overhand, right power, great ground game as well, filled out well. To me, Fedor, great hooks, great clinch work, knees, uppercuts. But man, these guys are both veterans, both super clever. And I think it really comes down to, Fedor has that timeless power, right? I mean, we all know about it. It can happen at any point. And listen, Rampage has a chin to go right with that power to match it. But to me, if it's a 5-round fight, and I've thought about this a lot, if it's a 5-round fight, I really think we could see Rampage win this. But in a 3-rounder, I have a feeling that if nothing else, in what I hope is not a boring, laborious fight, I have a feeling that Fedor could kind of point out wins in each round and then win that kind of anticlimactic draw when, listen, even you mentioned this referencing the Michael Chandler fight, I just don't want something dumb to happen. Far too often in Bellator, double knockdowns, people that fall off stools in their corners, far too many times dumb things happen in Bellator. Do not let anything dumb happen in this fight. I don't care if it's a knockout on round 1 or not. I just don't need something dumb.
You're asking a lot of this matchup. The way it looks for me, oh man, where do we start? I think Fedor still has obviously devastating power. Just teed off on Chael Sonnen. What he doesn't have, in my opinion, is the chin to go with the power. He can still give a shot like a heavyweight. He can't take a shot like a heavyweight. He really can't, especially not in his prime and in his Pride days. He can't take a shot like that anymore. And Quentin Jackson can still hit. The issue is a heavyweight, Rampage Jackson, who weighed in, I believe, at 265, 260, right near the heavyweight limit. This is a guy who's had trouble with his work ethic in the last few years. He's had trouble with his desire in the last few years. When he lost to Chael Sonnen, he just didn't look mentally in that fight. He didn't. He didn't look like he wanted it bad enough. It didn't look like he was well prepared. He had issues with his gas, with the pressure of Chael Sonnen, with his takedown defense. But it all seemed mental. Like he just didn't seem to want it that badly. This is a guy, if you put him at heavyweight, where making 205 is no longer an issue. That's no longer a motivator. That's no longer the thing getting him to the gym, and you can allow him to be as heavy as he wants to be. That could be a recipe for disaster, especially against Fedor, who can still hit, hasn't shown any gas issues lately, hasn't necessarily gone that long necessarily. He's been in 3-rounders, but hasn't shown a lot of gas issues. Does Quentin Jackson still have the desire to really do something in MMA? Does he really have the motivation to knock off Fedor? Does that mean a lot to him? Does going back to Japan re-energize him in a certain way? Because I think a lot of this fight's mental. And one thing Fedor hasn't really lost, he has lost his chin. His timing isn't what it used to be. He still has power. We haven't seen that huge drop off in desire. We haven't yet seen him phone it in that much. You could argue he did it in the Maldonado fight, but it's one of those things where, Fedor can still hurt you. And he still seems to care enough to get in there and do it. I don't know if I can say the same for Rampage. I really don't know. And it may come down to that desire. When you talk about long fights and difficulties late in fights, Rampage might have those simply because I don't know if he has that extra gas that he had when he was in his prime.
Well, if nothing else, we are going to find out answers to all these questions and more. We appreciate the fact that you guys, at a last minute, took time to listen to this preview, and you should know by now, we will be back very shortly with more commentary.